The first time Denise Holloway moved me out of the frame, she did it with a paper plate in one hand and a smile that would have looked Christian from the back of the room. It was the Sunday we held the memorial luncheon for Lorraine Pickett. I had known Lorraine for 22 years. I knew how she folded the corners of contribution envelopes when she was annoyed. I knew she never wore perfume because her sister got migraines. I knew she kept butterscotch in a tin that used to hold sewing needles, and I knew she had set aside part of her estate because she wanted the church to keep one room in this place from turning into some bright, disposable lounge for people who liked church the way airlines like loyalty programs. I also knew, because I had handled every memorial gift that came through Grace Hollow over the better part of 2 decades, that Lorraine's money had not been given for a branding project. None of that mattered while Denise was smiling at me over a tray of ham biscuits and pretending the room had simply become too modern for a woman like me. "Sharon," she said, soft enough to sound kind, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. "We're keeping today a little more streamlined. Pastor Caleb is handling the public remarks, and we thought it might be best not to weigh things down with administrative detail." Administrative detail. That was what she called the dead woman's wishes. That was what she called the paper trail I had spent years protecting while brighter people came and went and learned the same old lesson too late. In a church, anything that looks soft usually has iron inside it. I looked past Denise and saw the easel board set near the coffee urns. Somebody had printed a display with Lorraine's picture on it, one of the good ones from before her hands started trembling. Under it, in large, clean letters, was a line I had never seen before. Lorraine Pickett Memorial Gift. A founding part of the Renewal Commons campaign. That was the moment the room changed shape for me. I had come into the fellowship hall expecting grief arranged into casseroles, folded napkins, and the usual polite lies people tell around potato salad. Instead, I found a launch event. A memorial luncheon with floral centerpieces in church colors, donor cards tucked discreetly near the podium, and our new senior pastor standing near the windows with the look he got whenever he thought a room might love him on purpose. Pastor Caleb Mercer was 38, handsome in the polished, low-friction way some men train themselves to be handsome. Good hair, clean jaw, expensive humility. He knew how to bend at the waist when old women spoke to him, and how to let his voice go hushed when he wanted to make sincerity look like a spiritual gift. Half the church called him energetic, the other half called him a blessing. I called him what he was, which was a man who believed any problem could be managed if you controlled the room, the language, and the people who were allowed near the microphone. Denise was older than Caleb by maybe 15 years and twice as dangerous. Caleb needed admiration. Denise needed seating charts. He liked vision. She liked placement. She could decide who got thanked, who got introduced, who got parked by the tea dispensers, and who was gently explained out of the way. She didn't raise her voice. She edited air. That morning, she had edited me. I said, "Lorraine's memorial gift was not for any campaign." She kept smiling. "Today is about honoring her spirit of generosity." "No," I said. "Today is supposed to be about honoring Lorraine." Some people at the nearest table went quiet. Denise shifted her paper plate from one hand to the other. It was a tiny movement, but I knew what it meant. She had not expected me to answer her where witnesses could hear. Her smile tightened by a grain. "Are all trying to do that?" "Then you should take that sign down." Now she stopped pretending this was a casual exchange. Not enough to show anyone else, but enough for me. "Sharon, not here." That was the whole method. Not now, not here, not in that tone, not with those people listening. They never had to give. They just had to give your objection the wrong weather. If I'd pushed harder in that moment, I would have become exactly what they needed. A rigid old finance woman bringing bureaucracy into a room full of grief. Denise would have gone sad-eyed. Caleb would have stepped over with his palms half open. Someone would have said we all process loss differently. By dessert, I would have been the one who made Lorraine's day feel tense. So I did the only useful thing. I stepped back. Denise took that as surrender. That was her first mistake. I let her glide past me toward the podium. I let Caleb move into the soft center of the room and thank everyone for coming. I let him use Lorraine's name 3 times in 6 minutes, each time tied a little more snugly to the Renewal Commons vision. I let people nod. I let the family sit through it. I let the whole thing settle another layer deeper into public fact, because once something false has been repeated in a church with flowers around it, people stop asking whether it was true. Those start asking whether it would be rude it. I sat at the of a long table near the wall where the old choir robes used to hang before the storage closets got cleaned out for ministry optimization. I listened to Caleb praise Lorraine's faithfulness, her legacy of welcome, and her heart for the next generation. He said her final gift would help us create a front-of-house space that invited people with warmth, coffee, and conversation. Lorraine hated weak coffee. She called it brown regret. She also hated the phrase next generation when people used it to justify spending money on furniture. Nobody at the head table said that. Lorraine's niece Amy did not look impressed. That was one useful thing. Amy Pickett lived in Columbus and only came in every few months during Lorraine's decline, but she had her aunt's mouth when she was trying not to speak too soon. She sat 2 chairs from Caleb, not eating, not smiling, looking at the display board like she was trying to remember whether she had ever heard her aunt use the words Renewal Commons in her life. After the luncheon, while people stacked plates and made that low church hall sound of grief blending into logistics, I crossed to the board and read the smaller print under Lorraine's name. It thanked the Pickett family for partnering with the future of Grace Hollow through this transformative memorial contribution. Transformative memorial contribution. That was not Lorraine either. Lorraine used real nouns: chairs, hymnals, hearing loops, grease stains on the fellowship kitchen wall. She had no patience for words that needed a consultant to explain them. Amy came up beside me. "Did she really choose this?" she asked. I kept my eyes on the board. "No." She looked at me. "Then why is it up there?" "Because the people who approved it think nobody left in this church remembers how those funds were set." Amy stared at the sign another second. "Aunt Lorraine said something once about the prayer room. I was helping sort papers after the funeral. She said she wanted part of the money to keep that room quiet and open. She was worried it would get turned into something else." "It was not just something she said once," I told her. "It was written down." Amy's jaw set. "Then why am I hearing about coffee stations?" "Because they think pretty language travels faster than correction." She nodded once, hard. I could see anger beginning to settle into a shape on her face that might later become useful if it was handled carefully, and absolutely worthless if it was touched too soon. So I did not ask her for anything. I did not tell her to march into Caleb's office. I did not turn her into my instrument. I said, "Go home today. Keep anything from Lorraine that mentions memorial instructions. Do not call anybody yet." Amy studied me for a moment, then gave a short nod. "You know exactly how mad to be, don't you?" "Yes," I said. "That's why I'm not wasting it here." I drove home after cleanup with 3 aluminum pans in my trunk because in Baptist country, even anger comes home smelling like ham glaze. My house sat 10 minutes from the church in a quiet subdivision built in the late 90s by men who thought brick fronts could conceal every other compromise. I had lived there with my husband Walter until cancer turned him into paperwork and then memory. The dining room table was still the place where I put everything serious. Taxes, condolence cards, insurance forms, member records when I still worked full-time. There are people who turn grief into softness. Mine turned me into drawers. By 4 that afternoon, I had 3 binders on the table and 1 old gray file box on the floor beside me. Most people think church money is all general fund and faith. They think people put cash in an envelope, write "in memory of" across the front, and then some kindly committee sprinkles it where it seems appropriate. That is how sloppier churches function. Grace Hollow had once been better than sloppy. When I first took over finance under Pastor Glenn Rooker, who had all the charisma of a courthouse lamp and twice the integrity, memorial gifts were handled with a separate intake sheet, a designated ledger code, and a short form that stated donor intent if the family attached written guidance. If the gift involved a room, fixture, ministry purpose, or restricted use beyond general memorial support, It passed through the memorial committee, then to trustees if any physical changes were involved, and then to finance for disbursement. It was not glamorous, but it kept living people from using dead people as loose money. I found Lorraine's folder in 23 minutes. Cream file jacket, my handwriting on the tab. Pickett, Lorraine, memorial/restricted. Inside were the original acknowledgement letters, 2 contribution summaries, the typed note from Amy enclosing the family's instructions, and the committee record from 14 months earlier. The gift had been designated in 2 parts. One portion was for upkeep and continued accessibility of the quiet prayer room adjacent to the south hallway, the room Lorraine had used after her husband died, and later during treatment appointments when she still had strength enough to come sit there on weekday mornings. The second portion was to remain in a restricted memorial reserve attached to that room and related care needs, including replacement of the old hearing assist unit and maintenance of the seating and lighting. Not coffee bars, not lobby furniture, not first impression ministry. I sat there reading the papers twice, then a third time, because anger loves first glances and procedure hates them. The file also held something else. At the bottom, behind the committee memo, was a 1-page note I had forgotten. Lorraine herself had written it in blue ink and uneven lines after a fall made her grip uncertain. It was addressed simply to, "Whoever is still keeping track when I'm gone." That had been her sense of humor. She wrote that she had no interest in building one more smiling front room so people can stand around with paper cups pretending they are in fellowship. She wanted the prayer room kept plain and quiet and available to anybody who needs to sit still after bad news. She added that churches had a weakness for spending grief money where healthy people could see it. She hoped we would resist that temptation. I read that line 4 times. Churches had a weakness for spending grief money where healthy people could see it. Lorraine had been dead less than 4 months, and Caleb had already turned her into a campaign testimonial. I called nobody that night. That mattered more than it should have. There is a kind of person who hears about a violation and thinks action means speed. Call everyone, forward copies, march into offices, turn feeling into motion and mistake motion for force. I had spent enough years in church administration to know the opposite was usually true. Early noise gives clever people room to organize against you. Quiet lets them keep making choices in public. The next morning, I went to the church office under the simple excuse of dropping off serving utensils. Nina Ruiz was at the front desk. Nina had worked part-time in admin for 7 years and had the permanently alert face of a woman who had learned that every church secret eventually passed through a copier. "Morning, Miss Sharon," she said. "Morning." She lowered her voice. "Yesterday was something." "That is one word for it." Her eyes flicked toward Caleb's hallway, then back. "You didn't hear it from me, but Denise was saying after everyone left that she hoped you wouldn't make the memorial thing complicated." "I'm not the one who complicated it." Nina gave the smallest nod. "I figured." I set the pans down. "Nina, who approved that display copy?" "Communications put it together, but they got the language from the campaign packet." "There is a campaign packet now?" Her hesitation answered before her mouth did. "There's a preliminary one." "Where is it routing through?" "Caleb's office and Denise. Finance isn't really in the loop." Finance isn't really in the loop. That was not an accident. That was design. I said, "Who coded the Pickett transfer?" Nina looked almost offended for me. "I didn't know there was one until I saw the board." "Who has access?" "Caleb, Denise, Mark in bookkeeping, and Beth if they ask her to run reports." Mark Ellison had replaced me in the day-to-day bookkeeping role after I stepped back to part-time memorial oversight and quarterly review. Mark was competent in the way people are competent when everything is normal. He liked clean spreadsheets, quiet lunches, and not getting noticed. That made him useful to anyone who wanted an unusual thing to pass through under ordinary lighting. "Has there been a trustees meeting on the Commons project?" I asked. Nina shook her head. "There was a vision meeting, not trustees exactly." That phrase alone told me enough to be irritated for the rest of the week. Vision meetings were where accountability went when it wanted better branding. I thanked Nina and left. On the way out, I passed the south hallway and stopped by the prayer room. The door was propped open with a wedge because someone had been rolling in paint samples. 3 square cards sat on one chair. Soft sand, warm ivory, welcoming taupe. That room had 2 narrow windows, 6 padded chairs, a small table with tissue boxes, and a hearing assist receiver mounted beside the outlet. Lorraine had once spent 40 minutes in there with a woman whose son had overdosed. Another time, she sat alone in the back corner after her oncology consult and told me later it had been the only room left in the church that didn't seem to be auditioning for applause. I picked up the paint cards and put them back down. Then I went home and made a list. Not feelings, not speeches, just pressure points. At the top, I wrote, gift language, committee record, approval chain, family awareness, spending route, public use of Lorraine's name. Then I wrote the names under those things. Amy Pickett for family awareness. Harold Voss for committee record. Harold had been a deacon long enough to remember when the church still used mimeographs and people apologized before moving pew cushions. He had also served as secretary for the memorial committee until his knees made stairs into theology. If anybody besides me remembered how Lorraine's gift was classified, it would be Harold. Mark Ellison for spending route, though Mark by himself was less a source than a pressure gauge. He would not lie well if cornered, but he might cooperate beautifully with a lie as long as it came pre-formatted. Nina for timing. And one final name I hesitated over before writing. Thomas Reed. Tom Reed was an attorney in town, mid-50s, soft-spoken, handsome in a tired way, and currently serving on the trustee board because churches are always thrilled to have a lawyer until they remember lawyers read things. Tom was not brave, but he was careful. Careful men are often more valuable than brave men in places built on appearance. Bravery makes scenes. Carefulness leaves trails. I did not call him either. Instead, I waited 2 days and attended Wednesday dinner like I had no special reason to be there. That is one thing younger people never understand when they describe church politics from the outside. They think conflict in a church begins in meetings. It doesn't. Meetings are where conflict goes after being marinated in casseroles, side hugs, bulletin inserts, and whispers near the coffee. If you want to know which way a church is leaning, you watch who turns their body toward whom before the prayer starts. Grace Hollow sat on 40 years of habits and one newer coat of paint. It had once been a place where people knew who changed the air filters, who took casseroles to widowers, who made sure the hearing devices had batteries, and who could be trusted not to turn every budget decision into a testimony about growth. Then the older families started dying or downsizing, younger couples wanted energy, and the church hired Caleb to make us look less like a place people went after they got bad news. He was good at that, which was part of the problem. By the time I walked into Wednesday dinner, I could already tell the room had been briefed. Not formally, that would have been vulgar, but enough. The women who normally waved me into their corner gave me warm smiles with no invitation attached. One of the ushers patted my shoulder and told me he hoped I was doing all right after everything with Lorraine's service. He said it the way people mention weather after hearing about a wreck 2 streets over. I carried my tray to a side table and sat alone on purpose. From there, I could see Caleb moving between groups, using first names, laughing softly, touching chairbacks. Denise stayed near the dessert table, which suited her better. She could control a room without moving much. She looked over once, saw me by myself, and visibly relaxed. That told me something. People get comfortable around the powerless when they think the powerlessness is going to hold. Halfway through dinner, Harold Voss lowered himself into the chair across from me with the slow care of a man who knew every joint by its Christian name. "I hear you're causing trouble," he said. "That is what people call bookkeeping when it embarrasses them." He snorted. "I saw the display Sunday. Thought Lorraine might get up and throw a roll at somebody." "Wouldn't miss her odds." He ate 2 bites before saying, "You need something?" I said, "Do you remember the Pickett Memorial approval?" "I signed the committee minute. You signed the fund coding." "Do you remember any discussion about lobby renovation?" Harold stopped chewing. No. Do you remember why Lorraine restricted it? Because she hated noise. And because she thought churches had started confusing hospitality with retail. That sounds like her. He dabbed his mouth and leaned back. Caleb's pushing that front-end welcome nonsense hard. Denise likes it because donors can see it. Nobody writes checks for a quiet room down the hall. There was never supposed to be a donor showcase attached to Lorraine's name. I know that. Does Caleb? That depends on whether you mean now or before he decided not to care. Harold looked down at his tray. You're not wrong, but if you're about to go after them, do not do it in a way that lets them say this is just old guard resentment. I am very aware. He held my eyes. Good, because they are already calling it that. That landed exactly where it was meant to. I had expected as much, but hearing the phrase confirmed which costume they had chosen for me. Old guard resentment. In other words, history made bitter. A woman unable to release control. Somebody emotionally attached to old systems and old rooms and old importance. I asked, who said it? Harold shrugged once. Denise, mostly. Caleb says transition pain. Same perfume. There it was again. They never fight the fact. They relabel the feeling around the fact until the fact has to defend itself wearing the wrong clothes. I told Harold what I needed from him. Not a public stand. Not yet. Just confirmation, if asked in the proper setting, that Lorraine's memorial gift had gone through the committee as restricted support for the prayer room and related care. He looked mildly insulted. Sharon, I may be old, but I still know what I signed. I know. I just needed to hear you say it with your jaw set. He smiled a little. Then yes. The next person I watched was Mark. He was standing near the kitchen pass-through, talking to Beth from bookkeeping, and trying to look as if his life had never once included a restricted fund. Mark was 42, wore quarter zips in all seasons, and had perfected the posture of a man who believed competent neutrality was a moral virtue. When he saw me coming, he smiled too quickly. Hey, Sharon. Mark, how've you been? Old enough to know when somebody recodes money and hopes nobody asks. He blinked. I'm not sure what you mean. It was almost funny, not because he lied well, because he lied like a man who thought vagueness counted as innocence. I said, then I'll simplify it for you. Who moved the Pickett Memorial Funds into the Renewal Commons Project Code? Beth made an elegant excuse and vanished. Mark kept his smile for one more second, then set it down. There was a direction from leadership, he said. Leadership is not an accounting category. It was a transfer tied to campaign planning. Was there a memorial committee release? I assumed there had been. Did you verify? His eyes flicked toward Caleb's side of the room. That was answer enough. Mark, I said, there are only two possibilities here. Either you knew the restriction and moved it anyway, or you moved restricted money without checking the underlying designation. Which version would you like attached to your name if somebody ever asks carefully? He swallowed. It wasn't fully spent. That was the first useful thing he had said. How much? He hesitated too long. Some of it was pledged forward, not dispersed. How much was actually moved? I'd have to look. You will. He lowered his voice. Sharon, listen. Caleb said this fit the spirit of the gift. The dead do not donate in spirit, they donate in writing. He looked miserable, which I did not confuse with honorable. Misery is just fear without discipline. Please don't make this a huge thing, he said. It was already made a huge thing when they put Lorraine's face beside a campaign she never funded. I left him there with his tray. The next Sunday, the language got worse. Caleb used Lorraine from the platform. Not her money exactly. Not in the clean legal sense. He was still too polished for that. But he thanked the Pickett Memorial Family Contribution for helping launch a more welcoming first impression for the next season of ministry. He said it between the children's moment and the offering prayer, right where people's minds are most open to uninspected uplift. I sat 3 rows from the back and watched heads nod. Then I watched Amy Pickett not nod. After service, she found me near the south hallway. She had come in from Columbus again, which told me her irritation had stopped being abstract. "I found copies," she said quietly. "Aunt Lorraine's letter to the church office and the note in her folder at home. She says the prayer room twice." "Good." She also says she doesn't want her money used for anything public-facing and fashionable. Amy gave a thin laugh. That was the exact phrase. I closed my eyes for 1 second. Lorraine loved the clean kill. "Do not hand that to Caleb," I told her. "I wasn't planning to." "What were you planning?" "I was thinking about asking Denise after service why my aunt's memorial is suddenly financing a boutique lobby." That made me look at her. Amy had Lorraine's face narrowed into a younger frame and none of Lorraine's patience yet. Useful, but only if contained. "You can do that later," I said. "Not now. Right now, all that does is give them your anger without forcing their answer." Amy crossed her arms. "So what do I do? Sit on my hands while they use her like a fundraising mascot?" "Yes." She stared. "That's a terrible plan." "It is a temporary plan. There is a difference." "What are you waiting for?" "For them to invest more of themselves in the lie." Amy gave me a look that started skeptical and ended respectful. "You're a little scary." "No, I'm old enough to know timing is usually the weapon." We stood outside the prayer room a moment. The paint cards were gone. In their place was a folded measuring tape on the small table and a sample of upholstery fabric the color of weak oatmeal. Amy touched the chair back with 2 fingers. "She used to sit right there." "I know. She told me once this was the only room in the church where nobody tried to improve her." That line stayed with me all week. The pressure wave that followed was typical for people who think they are being subtle, while everybody with memory can hear the gears. First, my name disappeared from the next quarterly memorial review packet. Nina noticed before I did and slipped me a photocopy of the distribution list with a yellow sticky note that said, in her neat slanted hand, "Oops!" The question mark was the only honest thing on that page. Then Denise sent me an email full of polished gratitude, thanking me for my years of faithful administrative support and informing me that, in order to streamline communication going forward, memorial coordination would now sit under a combined care and hospitality umbrella. That phrase alone deserved jail. Care and hospitality, as if grief and decorative signage were cousins. I replied with 1 sentence. "Please confirm whether this structural change was approved by trustees and whether restricted memorial funds remain under separate review." She did not answer. Caleb did, 2 days later, with the sort of message men like him write when they want to sound pastoral and final at the same time. He thanked me for my concern, emphasized that the heart of Lorraine's generosity is being honored, and suggested we schedule a private conversation if I was having difficulty adjusting to new operational rhythms. New operational rhythms. That was his version of old guard resentment. Same poison, just printed on better stationery. I printed the email and put it in the file box. Then Tom Reed called me. He did not mention the memorial fund on the phone. Men like Tom do not say dangerous nouns before they have checked the room around them. He said, "Are you home?" "Yes." "Mind if I stop by?" 20 minutes later, he was sitting at my dining table with his suit coat folded over the chair back and a face that had never learned how to relax around church politics. Tom was one of those men who always seemed a little apologetic for being useful. "I'm not here in any official capacity," he said first. "Then you're here in the useful one." He gave a tired half-smile. "I heard there was concern about the picket funds." "You heard correctly. Denise says this is mostly a communication issue." "Of course she does." Tom took off his glasses and set them on the table. "Caleb says the money is aligned with Lorraine's broader values of welcome and reflection." "Did Lorraine become a concept while I was in the kitchen?" Tom exhaled through his nose. "That's close to what I thought." I handed him the copies. Not everything, just enough. Lorraine's handwritten note, the committee summary, Amy's family instruction letter, my printout of Caleb's email. Tom read without interruption. That was another mark in his favor. People who interrupt documents usually do it because they can feel the paper turning against them. When he finished, he tapped the page lightly. If this is what the records show, they are overreaching. That is the polite term. He looked up. How public is the campaign link so far? Board display, platform language, memorial luncheon signage, donor whispering, enough that people will call it established if nobody corrects it. Tom nodded slowly. Do you want me to raise it formally? Not yet. His eyebrows went up. You're telling a lawyer to wait? I'm telling a trustee not to save them before they build more of the scaffold. He sat back, considering me. That feels dangerous. It is. For them? For accuracy. People make their clearest mistakes after they think the difficult woman has tired herself out. Tom put his glasses back on. Denise is already framing this as transition tension. I know, Harold said. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of Lorraine's note. You may not like hearing this, but there's a version of this where they don't think they're stealing. They think they're translating. I know exactly what they think they're doing. That's why it's ugly. Theft is easy to denounce. Translation comes with prayer. Tom did not argue. He read the handwritten line again about grief money and healthy people. Then he asked, What do you need from me? Memory, when the time comes. He understood that immediately. Not leadership, not rescue, memory. To say what the process was before prettier people renamed it. He stood to leave and stopped by the prayer room on his way out because I asked him to. He came back to the dining room doorway after less than a minute. They moved the hearing assist receiver, he said. Where? It's not on the wall. I drove to the church the next morning and found it in a storage bin outside the trustee's closet, coiled with extension cords and old Christmas lights. That was when my anger stopped being mostly procedural. There are churches that think disrespect is just a tone problem. It isn't. Disrespect turns material very fast. Once somebody decides the old woman is the obstacle and the room she protected is old thinking, you start finding actual objects removed by actual hands. The hearing assist unit, the small lamp Lorraine liked, the tissue box stand. Things disappear before principles do because moving a thing feels practical. I took a picture of the storage bin for myself, not because I planned to use the photo later, but because I wanted the order of injury clear in my mind. Then I put the receiver back where it belonged, and I waited. Waiting did not mean sleeping. It meant showing up, keeping my face level, and watching where confidence turned careless. 2 Sundays later, Denise asked me to meet with her and Caleb in his office. The request came by email under the subject line, Pastoral Conversation, which was enough to sour my coffee before I even opened it. People only call something pastoral when they intend to do human resources in a softer font. Caleb's office had been redone the first year he came. New rug, better lamps, 2 bookshelves curated for visible seriousness, a framed print on the wall that said, "Welcome is holy," in thin black letters like a boutique commandment. Denise was already seated when I came in. Caleb stood up with that gentle energy of his and moved around the desk like he was greeting someone at a visitation. "Sharon," he said, taking both my hands before I could stop him. "Thank you for coming." "You emailed me 3 times." He smiled as if that were charming instead of accurate. "We wanted to make space for a healthier conversation." Denise gestured to the chair across from them. There was a legal pad on the table between us, blank except for the date at the top in Denise's handwriting. That was not for notes. That was furniture, a way to make the room feel like process instead of pressure. Caleb started with praise. He thanked me for my years of service, for my steadfastness, for holding so much institutional memory, which is the sort of thing people say right before they ask you to surrender its authority. Then he moved to concern. He said several people had noticed I seemed troubled by the way Lorraine's gift was being celebrated. Celebrated, not used. Another careful word. "I am troubled by the way it is being used," I said. Caleb folded his hands. I think the difficulty here may be one of interpretation. No! Denise jumped in before he had to. Sharon, nobody is denying the prayer room mattered to Lorraine, but gifts like this often carry both specific intention and broader spirit. We're trying to honor the larger heart of what she cared about. By putting coffee signage under her face? Denise let the insult sit on her without acknowledging it. Skilled woman. By creating a more welcoming front environment that reflects the same hospitality Lorraine embodied. That is not what the records say. Caleb leaned forward, warm and disappointed. I've read what you sent. I understand why you feel protective. There it was. Feel. Not think, not know, just feel. This is not protectiveness, I said. It is restriction. He sighed softly, as if I had chosen hardness over fellowship. Sometimes, language created in one season of church life doesn't map neatly onto the needs of another. Then the honest thing would have been to ask before you mapped her into a campaign. Denise's eyes sharpened. This is exactly the tone problem we're trying to address. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was perfect. There I was, in a room with a man who had already used Lorraine's memorial from the platform and a woman who had put her picture beside a campaign display, and somehow the problem before us was my tone. That is what people say, I told Denise, when the facts have started to smell bad. Caleb sat back. He changed tactics right in front of me. Less shepherd, more leader. Let me be direct, he said. Grace Hollow cannot be governed by legacy bottlenecks. We respect what came before, but we also have to move. Denise and I are trying to bring coherence to systems that have been fragmented for years. By bypassing the memorial review process? By reducing unnecessary friction. Restricted funds are friction. His jaw moved once. Small, controlled. Not when the use is materially aligned. You do not get to decide that alone. Denise put both palms lightly on the table. Sharon, are you asking us to believe that Lorraine would object to using her generosity in a way that blesses more people? I am telling you Lorraine did object. In writing. Caleb looked at me for a long moment. Then he said the thing he had wanted to say from the beginning. I wonder if part of this is that you're still grieving the loss of your role here. There are moments when you can feel an entire strategy reveal itself. Not the specific one, the larger one. The shape of how they intend to survive you. I looked at him and realized they had already decided what category I belonged in. Not procedural threat. Emotional residue. A widow with old files and a fading purpose. Somebody who had mistaken usefulness for ownership and now could not bear to be moved aside by change. That was better than if they had taken me seriously. It was cleaner. I said, if I were grieving my role, Pastor, I would be asking for my seat back. I'm asking why you spent a dead woman's money where she told us not to. The room went flat. Denise spoke first. Nobody spent anything improperly. Then give me the transfer record, approval path, and disbursement sequence. She blinked once. That is not an appropriate ask from someone outside the current structure. There was no current structure when you needed Lorraine's face for your sign. Caleb stood up. The meeting was over in his mind, which meant he thought he had reached the point where presence itself would solve the problem. Men like him often stand when they need their body to carry the authority their reasoning did not. We're not going to litigate this with each other, he said. I noticed. You prefer translation. Denise rose more slowly and moved to the door. I think we need to put this conversation on pause. That was her final form of eviction, polite and terminal. So I let her. On the way out, Caleb touched my elbow and lowered his voice. I hope you hear me. I don't want you isolating yourself over this. I looked at his hand until he took it off. Then stop building a lie around a woman you never bothered to know. When I stepped into the hallway, Nina was carrying a box of copier paper toward supply. She did not look at me. Good girl. Looking would have made her a witness before she was ready. I drove home and wrote down every line I could remember from the meeting while it was still warm. That was another lesson age teaches. Never trust outrage to archive itself accurately. Then I put the notes in the gray file box. 3 days later, the church newsletter went out. On page 2, under Ministry Updates, there was a polished little block about the Renewal Commons vision. It thanked the generosity of recent memorial partners, including the Pickett family, for helping move the initiative toward launch. No dollar amount, no lies you could point to in one sentence, just a smooth enough fusion of names and vision that anyone reading it would assume Lorraine's money belonged there. I did not call Amy. Amy called me. "They did it again," she said before I had hello out. "Yes." "I am done being patient." "No, you're not." "Sharon!" "Listen to me. Did you save the newsletter?" "Yes." "Good. Put it with Lorraine's note." "You sound happy." "I sound interested." Amy was quiet a second. "You really are waiting for them to bury themselves." "I'm waiting for them to make correction expensive." She let out a sharp breath that might have been a laugh. "That is a terrible sentence." "It's a useful one." By then, the room politics had started to sort themselves. People in church seldom align by principle at first. They align by discomfort tolerance. Who can bear a public correction? Who can bear the thought that leadership might have been sloppy? Who would rather swallow one ugly fact than sit through a season of meetings? That is where the true map appears. I began hearing versions of the same thing from 4 directions. From the choir loft, Denise says Sharon is struggling with change. From the women's Bible study, Pastor Caleb is trying to unify old systems, and some people are resisting. From trustees' adjacent circles, there may have been a paperwork misunderstanding. From younger families in the Commons orbit, isn't this all still kind of honoring Lorraine, though? That last one was the only question in the bunch. The rest were fragrances. At Thursday Quilting Group, a woman named Mavis Lowry asked me, in the bright tone people use when they want to touch a bruise and deny the finger, whether I was all right with the prayer room updates. Mavis had never once sat in the prayer room. "What updates?" I asked. "Oh, just making it feel less dated. Denise said Lorraine's gift opened some possibilities." By then, it had spread. Not just campaign language, room-level conversion. The lie was circulating on its own. I said, "Mavis, Lorraine's gift was not given for cosmetic updates." Mavis smiled too quickly. "Well, I'm sure they know what they're doing." That sentence told me Mavis knew the opposite. I did not answer. People hate silence when they have just volunteered trust they do not actually possess. She babbled another few words and moved away to examine fabric squares she did not want. The trouble with churches is not that they lack intelligence, it is that they are saturated with deference. Everybody knows more than they say. They just keep hoping someone else will pay the social price of saying it first. That price went up in mid-October when Denise announced a legacy and welcome evening for key donors and ministry leaders. It was supposed to celebrate the church's history while introducing the next phase of community-facing renovation. She put Lorraine's picture on the invitation email again. Smaller this time, more artful, worse. The evening would include light food in the fellowship hall, a short presentation in the sanctuary, and special recognition of legacy gifts shaping tomorrow. That was when I stopped merely waiting. I called Amy and told her to come in that weekend. I called Harold and asked him to dig out his old committee minutes binder from the year Lorraine's gift was approved. I called Tom Reed and said, "They scheduled their own timing." He answered, "I had a feeling." Then I called one person I had avoided up to that point, Beth Sutter in bookkeeping. Beth was the opposite of Mark. She knew numbers, knew people, and knew when men in leadership were using the first category to control the second. She had stayed quiet because Beth had 2 boys in college and no appetite for becoming a testimony illustration about bitterness. I did not judge her for that. Moral courage sounds prettier when your dental insurance doesn't depend on the church. We met in the parking lot of a grocery store, which sounds dramatic until you realize middle-aged women in small towns have been exchanging dangerous truth near produce for generations. Beth got into my car and said, "I can't stay long." "You won't need to." She held her tote bag in her lap like a shield. "Mark told me not to discuss campaign coding with you." "That was decent of him." "He's scared." "He should be." Beth looked at me, then out the windshield. The picket money was moved in 2 phases. First, into a temporary campaign holding line, then one portion was committed against vendor planning for front entry redesign. I don't think the final check on the furniture package has gone out yet, but the reserve is already being represented as pledged support. That was clean and ugly. Who authorized it? Mark entered the transfer. Caleb verbally approved. Denise sent the note saying Lorraine's gift should be recognized in campaign material. There is no memorial committee release in the file. Mark made a note that designation consistent with hospitality purpose per leadership review. Leadership review. I closed my eyes once. Do you have a copy? Beth's hand tightened on the tote. No. Can you get one? Not without leaving tracks. I don't need the document. I need the wording remembered. That I can do. I asked her 3 more questions. Dates, amount proportions, whether trustees had seen the line item as a restricted transfer or simply as campaign support. Beth told me enough to confirm what I already suspected. Caleb and Denise had not just bent the spirit, they had changed the category before the room could notice. When she opened the car door to leave, she said, "I don't want to be dragged into a war." "It isn't a war," I told her. "It's a correction." "That sounds worse." "It usually is." That Sunday, Amy sat with me in the back after service while the sanctuary emptied in warm currents of after-church perfume and football plans. She had brought Lorraine's original home copy of the memorial instruction letter in a clear sleeve, along with 2 birthday cards and a grocery list for no reason except grief makes people travel with evidence when they miss somebody. "She really wrote public-facing and fashionable," Amy said, handing me the page again. "Yes." She also underlined it. That was kind of her. Amy looked toward the front, where Caleb was talking with a young couple about children's ministry. "I want him to say it out loud." "He will." "How do you know?" "Because men like that always think they can explain the room back into agreement." She leaned against the pew. "What if he can?" "Then he deserves the church." That made her smile in spite of herself. "You are brutal." "No, I'm accurate." We walked the south hallway together and found new brass sign mock-ups propped against the wall. One read, "Quiet Prayer and Care Room" in script. The other read, "Legacy Reflection Room." That second one nearly made me physically ill. Legacy Reflection Room. Not because the words were offensive, because they were vague enough to replace the original purpose without looking like replacement. That is how institutions strip a room. They do it with synonyms first. Amy took a photo with her phone. "Delete that from your cloud later," I said. She looked at me. "You think like a very polite criminal." "I think like someone who has seen bad people quote partial evidence." At home that night, I spread everything across the dining room table again and could feel the story settling into sequence. Not script, sequence. First, the public memorial claim, then the platform reinforcement, then the newsletter, then the donor event, then the room signage, then, underneath all that, the hidden accounting route and missing memorial release. It was enough if the right people carried it in the right order. I finally decided to let them believe I had tired out. On Monday morning, I sent Caleb and Denise a very short email. "Thank you for meeting with me. I've made my concern known and will step back from further direct discussion for now. I trust the church will handle memorial stewardship with care." That email cost me more than anything I had done up to that point. Not because it was exactly false. I did trust the church. I did not trust the people currently narrating it, but I knew how it would sound on the other side. Denise would hear retreat. Caleb would hear pastoral breakthrough. Anybody they mentioned it to would hear Sharon has calmed down. By Wednesday, the results started coming in. Nina told me Denise was so relieved things had de-escalated. Mark began looking me in the eye again. Caleb stopped sending softening emails. and the legacy and welcome evening was expanded from a donor appreciation gathering into a broader public launch with a visual presentation in the sanctuary and a walkthrough of proposed commons changes afterward. They were making the lie bigger because they thought the difficult woman had folded. That was the stretch I had been waiting for, and they walked right into it. Smiling, grateful, half convinced their kindness had healed me. It almost made me admire them. Almost. The week before the event, I built the packet. No drama, no red tabs, just order. Lorraine's handwritten note first, because institutions will argue with process longer than they will argue with a dead woman's plain sentence. Then Amy's family instruction letter. Then the memorial committee summary. Then Harold's old minutes showing the designation language. Then a short chronology of public use. Luncheon display, platform mention, newsletter language, event invitation, signage progression. Then the email from Caleb about broader spirit and my concern. Then one clean page stating the accounting problem as far as it could be stated without pretending I had access to records I did not control. Lorraine Pickett's restricted memorial gift had been publicly represented and partially routed toward a campaign without evidence of memorial committee release or trustee approval consistent with the written designation. I addressed the cover note to Tom Reed and copied Paul Danner, who chaired trustees, and Miriam Cho, who had enough backbone to ask questions without decorating them first. I also copied Amy as family representative. I wrote that I was not requesting a personal remedy. I was requesting immediate review, because delay now increased both institutional risk and moral injury. That was the whole point, not my feelings, their exposure. I hand-delivered the packet on Tuesday. Tom called Wednesday afternoon. "This is enough," he said. "That is all I wanted." He told me Paul wanted to speak with Caleb and Denise privately first. Of course he did. Churches always try to convert a structural violation into a pastoral weather event before they admit the roof is leaking. I said, "If they see this without a formal hold, they will run ahead of it." "I know." "Miriam?" "She agrees with you." That helped. Miriam did not dramatize anything, which meant when she got firm, people noticed. They called a restricted trustee session for Thursday evening, before the donor event. I was not in the room. That was deliberate. If I had sat there, Denise would have spent half the time reframing the issue as Sharon Bell's unresolved attachment to relevance. Without me there, the paper had to stand on its own. Tom summarized afterward from his car. Caleb said the use was materially aligned with Lorraine's broader values. Denise said the church had to move beyond siloed legacy restrictions if it wanted to serve new people well. Miriam asked where the written release was. There wasn't one. Mark admitted he entered the transfer under verbal direction and never confirmed release authority himself. Nina's role in the campaign language surfaced too. At that point, the trail had widened beyond what Denise could contain with tone. The trustees placed a partial hold. No further disbursement from the picket line. No final campaign accounting entry using Lorraine's gift. But Paul still wanted the event to proceed with adjustments, meaning Lorraine's name would be pulled from the main presentation, while the rest of the evening moved forward as if that counted for prudence. Friday morning, Nina called me from the supply closet. "Denise is furious," she whispered. "They had communications redo the slide deck before 8. Caleb is telling people there were family sensitivity questions." Family sensitivity? I know. Is the board still up? No, they moved it. Movement meant heat. That told me enough. The legacy and welcome evening started at 6 on Saturday. I did not dress for battle. Navy slacks, cream blouse, gray cardigan. Pearls Walter gave me years ago, back when we still thought hard seasons arrived in other people's houses. Amy came with me. Harold came too, carrying his old folder. Tom was already there, standing near the back of the fellowship hall with the expression of a man about to disappoint everybody for the right reason. The room had been staged within an inch of insult. Linen runners, soft uplighting, framed church history photos beside clean boards carrying phrases like "welcoming flow" and "legacy rooted, future ready." The language wasn't sinful. That was what made it useful. Caleb moved through the room, greeting donors and older families with that low-friction warmth of his. Denise held her ground near the display boards, all posture and control. When she saw me with Amy, she recovered fast enough that most people would have missed the first half-second. "Sharon," she said. "Amy, I'm glad you both came." "We wouldn't miss a public use of Lorraine," I said. Her smile tightened by a thread. "Tonight is about the church as a whole." "That hasn't stopped you before." Amy stood quiet beside me, which was smarter than anger. Denise measured us both, then glanced toward the sanctuary doors. She already knew the room felt less safe than she had planned. We moved into the sanctuary a few minutes later. The opening was smooth. Caleb talked about legacy, sacrifice, continuity, and the people who had carried Grace Hollow through hard years. For 10 minutes, he sounded almost honest. Then he shifted into future language. Welcome, first impressions, community flow, younger families, visible generosity. He clicked to the Commons rendering. Tom stood, not theatrically, just enough to stop the slide from becoming fact. "Before this goes further," he said, "trustees need to note that restricted fund questions are under active review, and no campaign representation involving the Pickett Memorial gift should be understood as settled." The room went still in pieces. Caleb looked toward him with professional calm tightening over surprise. "Tom, those concerns are being handled appropriately." "They are being handled now," Tom said, "because they were not handled appropriately before." Denise half rose. "This is not the time." Miriam stood too. The time passed when Lorraine Pickett's memorial designation was publicly tied to this project without final review. That changed the room more than Tom had. People could write him off as legal caution. They could not write Miriam off as appetite for conflict. Amy stood beside me. "My aunt is not a fundraising theme," she said. "She wrote what her memorial gift was for. Some of us are done hearing it translated into something prettier." No one moved. Caleb opened his hands. "Amy, we hear your concern. That is exactly why we've paused to seek clarity." "You paused because you got caught," she said. Paul Danner rose at last and announced the presentation was suspended pending trustee review. Denise looked at him like furniture had disobeyed. Caleb tried one more appeal to tone and larger mission. I stood then, not for drama, just to keep the language from floating away. "The gross overreaction was using a dead woman's money where she told us not to," I said, "and then calling the objection a tone problem." A murmur moved through the room. Harold stood with his folder. "I signed the original memorial committee record," he said. "The Pickett gift was restricted to the prayer room and its care. Anybody saying otherwise is rewriting what we approved." That did it. Once an old deacon says rewriting in a sanctuary, people stop hearing this as tension and start hearing it as violation. Tom spoke again, no softness left in his voice. "This is a governance issue involving restricted intent, administrative routing, and public representation. The project discussion ends tonight." Caleb tried one last line about partial understanding and not shaming the body. I answered, "Then you should have been afraid of complete understanding sooner." Nobody clapped. Thank God. The room simply broke formation. The fellowship hall afterward felt like the aftermath of a funeral where someone had read the wrong will. Donors avoided the display boards. Younger couples looked offended that governance had intruded on their evening of tasteful hope. Denise vanished into the kitchen corridor with Paul and Tom behind her. Caleb was ringed briefly by people who still needed him to be fine, but even that circle thinned. Monday's emergency trustee meeting ran 4 hours. I was present for part of it as a source, not a complainant. That distinction mattered. Churches shrink anything they can into a personal dispute if you give them 1 inch of carpet. The evidence held. Beth confirmed the transfer note language. Nita confirmed the origin of the campaign wording. Harold confirmed the memorial process. Amy read Lorraine's line about healthy people spending grief money where they could see it. Nobody in that room recovered from hearing a dead woman preempt them. Caleb tried every available route. Good faith interpretation, broader spirit of welcome, urgency, outdated systems. He argued the prayer room itself was not being eliminated, only integrated into a larger hospitality vision. Then he made his worst mistake. He said, "At some point, we have to decide whether faith communities are governed by the dead or by the living mission in front of us." Miriam answered before anyone else could. "We are governed by honesty," she said. "And honesty includes what was entrusted to us by people no longer here to defend themselves." Tom added, "And by written restriction where applicable." After that, the vote was only paperwork. Trustees froze the Renewal Commons project pending full funding review. They removed all public material linking Lorraine's memorial gift to the project. They restored the picket funds to the original restricted line and documented that no alternate use could occur without proper review consistent with the written designation. They reinstated separate memorial stewardship review until new procedures could be lawfully adopted. They ordered an internal audit of restricted fund handling for the prior 18 months. Denise was removed from leadership over campaign communications, pending review. In plain English, she lost the room. Caleb remained pastor. That was always the likely outcome. Churches do not discard charismatic men unless the smell reaches the parking lot. But he lost the easy glide. The next Sunday, he stood in the pulpit and offered a narrow apology full of phrases like premature public language and stewardship clarity. He did not say my name. He did not have to. Everyone knew who had made the church remember the difference between welcome and theft. After service, I did not join the receiving line. I went straight down the south hallway and opened the prayer room. The chairs were back where they belonged. The hearing assist receiver had been remounted. The ugly script mock-up was gone. Somebody had dusted the side table and replaced the tissues. The room was plain, quiet, and unimproved. After a month of glossy language, it looked indecently honest. Amy came in behind me. "So that's it?" she asked. "No," I said. She waited. "The project is frozen. The money is back where it belongs. Denise is finished in the form she prefers. Caleb has lost authority in the only way men like him feel it. But no, that is not the end." "What is?" I looked around the room. "This. A room that stayed what it was for." She nodded slowly. "Aunt Lorraine would still hate the paint color." She hated most paint. That was the first time either of us laughed cleanly in weeks. The residue settled over Grace Hollow the way dust settles after a shake. Not dramatic, permanent. Denise missed several Sundays, then returned to a back pew with the expression of a woman hoping absence had ripened into dignity. It had not. People moved around her carefully, which is church language for social quarantine without paperwork. Mark kept his job because cowardice is easier to classify than malice, and because he cooperated quickly once the room turned. Beth got quieter but straighter. Nina stopped writing apologetic sticky notes because church admin was no longer being used as camouflage quite so freely. Tom Reed proposed a formal, restricted funds revision a month later. Dry, precise, difficult to romanticize. I liked him more after that. Public embarrassment improves some men. As for Caleb, he kept preaching. The church did not split. Nobody hauled boxes to the curb. But he had to work harder for the same silence, and that changed his face. People listened for omissions now. Once a congregation starts doing that, a pastor is still powerful, but no longer effortless. My own life did not turn into triumph. No banquet. No restoration ceremony. Good. I would have skipped it. What changed was colder and more useful. People stopped speaking to me like I was a retired nuisance they could thank into irrelevance. When I asked a question, they answered it as if the noun itself mattered. That was enough for me. One Wednesday in late November, I found Caleb alone in the fellowship hall reviewing budget boards. He looked up and chose charm, because trained men do that when they sense witness. "Sharon," he said, "how are you?" "Exact." He almost smiled. "I'm sorry this became so painful." "It became painful the moment you decided Lorraine's memory was flexible." He looked tired, more human, less forgivable. I still believe I was trying to serve the church, he said. I know, I told him. That's why it was ugly. He waited. You think I'm a fraud? No. If you were a fraud, this would be simpler. You're a man who thinks sincerity can wash appetite clean. He said nothing to that. I picked up my purse. You keep talking as if intent is the whole body. It isn't. Sometimes it's just the cologne. I left him standing there with his budget board. By Christmas, Miriam had placed a small brass plaque inside the prayer room, not outside where healthy people could admire it, but on the interior shelf where only people sitting long enough to need quiet would notice. It said, "In memory of Lorraine Pickett, kept quiet on purpose." That was the only public language about her that ever sounded clean to me. The corridor stayed different after that. People lowered their voices near the room again. Denise never regained her old orbit. Caleb preached a whole series on integrity the following spring, which would have been unbearable if it had not also been funny. He was better after the fall. Not holy, better. I stayed where I had been. Not central, not decorative. Available when nouns needed defending. Every now and then, someone would try to reframe the whole thing as unfortunate misunderstanding. Usually a younger couple, sometimes a man who loved momentum more than memory. I gave them the same answer every time. No. They knew enough to ask and chose not to. That ended most conversations worth ending. In March, nearly 6 months after the luncheon, I sat alone in the prayer room while rain moved against the narrow windows in long gray threads. I thought about how close they had come, not to winning, to converting one more piece of human grief into something healthy people could point at while congratulating themselves for growth. What saved Grace Hollow, if anything did, was not my anger. It was the fact that for one brief season, enough people got embarrassed by specifics at the same time. That is not revival. It is just decent accounting with witnesses. I stood to leave and looked once at the little brass plaque. Kept quiet on purpose. That line was true of Lorraine. It was true of the room. It was true of more women than churches like to admit. Quiet is not surrender. A lot of the time, quiet is storage. When I stepped into the hallway, I heard voices in the foyer. New families. Somebody laughing. Somebody asking where the nursery was. Church life moving on with all its mixed motives and folded bulletins and minor hypocrisies. No thunder, no credits, just the building doing what buildings do after they survive being used badly for one more season. Nina passed with a stack of sign-up sheets. Still there, she said, nodding toward the prayer room. Yes. Good. I went out the side entrance into cold air that smelled like wet mulch and old brick. From the corner of the building, I could still see the front windows where Denise had wanted the Commons reveal to glow like a brochure. They looked ordinary now, just church glass reflecting a low sky. Some people think justice has to feel warm to count. I have never found that true. Most real justice feels cooler than the fantasy version. It does not restore youth, return the dead, or rebuild innocence. It just puts the thing back where it belonged and makes certain people live in the shadow of what they tried. That was enough for me. Somewhere behind me, inside the building, a door closed softly. Then the church went quiet again,